But even if you were able to list the characteristics of the cause of the expansion of the universe, or the cause of the local presentation of the universe, or however you wanted to word it, even if those characteristics were similar to the proposed characteristics of an unproven God, that still doesn't make them identical. Oh, well, it had to be something timeless because time didn't exist before the Big Bang. Okay, well, it doesn't even make sense to talk about before the Big Bang, and maybe that cosmology is not correct, but it has to be timeless. Okay. But really, in that context, all it means is that it's not bound by the time within the local presentation of the universe. It doesn't mean that it's not bound by any time. It doesn't mean that it's not bound by metatime and the metaverse or anything like that. It just means that X is not bound by the time constraints of the local presentation of the universe. But that's obvious and true for anything that would be this change since time began. Our local presentation of time began then. Well, it's spaceless. You can do exactly the same thing with it. It's not made up of the stuff of this particular universe if it was something external to it that caused it and not something internal to it that we haven't identified yet.
Okay, what do you think here about the spaceless and timeless ideas and trying to get hypotheses without God?
Do you want to start off with it? Because you seem to have quite a lot of interesting stuff we can go through.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a few things here when I think about. So it seems like Matt's just trying to grasp at any other hypothesis, like anything that's not God that can explain like the cause of the universe, assuming like the universe began to exist, which is fine because I'm not a big fan of like conclusive proof that like demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that like God exists. So that's why I think like comparing theories and looking at like what's expected on one theory and on the other is like a more favorable approach to trying to like look at the question of like, does God exist? So like if Matt's gonna do like the matter energy proposal, well, I'd say, okay, Matt, let's just look at like how like the theistic theory does compared to like the matter energy theory. Like, does it predict things like fine tuning or like consciousness or things like that? And then I also think that when we're looking at this question, it seems like to me, Matt starts out with like this idea that there's a super low probability of God existing. And it seems like he does this a lot in his debates on like the resurrection or things like this, because it seems like to Matt, any explanation other than God, that's a better explanation, which is the probability of God is like super, super, super low. Well, then that's probably the right approach. But then that's the question at hand is like, is the probability of theism like super low, which is a different debate. So I think that's something like when I look at it, Matt, because it seems like when he's looking at this, he's like, it's impossible for God to exist or very unlikely. So like any other explanation must be better. So that's just a few of the thoughts I had at this clip.
Mm-hmm. I think what you're discussing about that idea of prior probability is very interesting because normally when you look at a hypothesis, you normally start off with like, at least if it's a more experiential one, you'll say, well, if I like, is this person going to eat breakfast tomorrow? Unless you fully know at least further things about that person or not, you're going to say, well, it's probably around 50-50 to just kind of give it like a balance. And then with further evidence, you take it a bit further to one side or the other. And I think it's quite important to use this kind of like this state of, I wouldn't say state of like not no knowledge, but rather like this like lack of understanding about anything else to say, well, perhaps if we don't know any other further kind of parts, we could say, well, it's just 50-50. And as a result, when you just say, well, let's treat the prior probability as very low, that's perhaps not doing the argument or the idea of much justice. And I think one thing else that you can perhaps add from this is that the idea of timeless or meta time that he raises in the first place may as well be correct. It's not all about, well, everything that is in time has to have a cause. That's not necessarily what the Kalam argument says. It's very possible that there is time before the beginning of the universe. Perhaps if you take an Augustinian view of the world, like the time is just kind of like a perspective or like a third person. I'm not exactly sure how we would explain it, but it's kind of like God is here. God has like his own kind of structure of time, and then time moves as subjective or in relation to the time of God. So in that situation, you may as well have the beginning of the universe in relationship to the time of God, and there is time before that. So there are a lot of further things that we can explore here and we can discuss, but it doesn't necessarily seem that what he raises here as his objections actually defeat the idea that God cannot be the explanation, or God is not the best explanation. And furthermore, I think that there is also good mathematical arguments, or at least philosophical arguments, that any physical kind of entity or any physical being has to be temporally finite. And as a result, if you approach it from that perspective, it doesn't matter whether you have 5 million universes before this. If they're all physical, then that means they must have a beginning as well. So I don't necessarily think that pushing it back just one universe actually helps the argument a lot.
That's super helpful. I think like just comparing worldviews is a really good kind of way of thinking about this as well. So I just want to emphasize that. And you can check out Graham Oppie and Kenny Pierce's debate book. It's a really good book on like this exact question of like how should we like argue about like God's existence and things, and they get into like cosmological arguments and such. So that's helpful here if you want to go further in this dialect. But let's get into this next section where he's going to talk about the Kalam not mentioning God.